Hi everyone, my name is Ron Berg, and today I'll be talking about some key developments that laid the foundation for business process management in the 1990s. To first understand where BPM comes from, we should start with business process reengineering, or business process redesign, or BPR for short. This was an idea that gained popularity in the early 90s after a series of articles and white papers and other media were published showing how companies could become more efficient and productive by basically overhauling all of their processes. However, this kind of had waned off by the late 90s after companies were spending a lot of money and not seeing the results they wanted from their BPR initiatives. This was from a few different reasons. The first was concept misuse, which was the idea basically that uh, every single change initiative in an organization became BPR. So anything, even when it didn't involve a process, was BPR, and it became kind of a hot mess to figure out what actually was BPR and what wasn't. The second was over radicalism, which stemmed from an idea of from Michael Hammer, who was one of BPR's champions, of don't automate, obliterate. Basically saying, don't try to automate processes you don't need, figure out what you don't need and get rid of it. However, this kind of led to obliterating processes that were needed, but maybe just needed a more gradual approach than just redoing everything. Third, support immaturity basically was that the idea was great, but the technology hadn't caught up to it yet. So even when people were trying to implement BPR, they might not have had the tools available to them to successfully do it. Now, getting to BPM, business process management, this came about around the end of the 90s, first started gaining headway due to a couple of key factors, stemming actually from BPR. So the first was that data started emerging that process-oriented organizations were doing better than non-process-oriented organizations. So organizations that were trying to basically manage their processes or keep up with their processes as a way of gaining efficiency and focusing on customers were successful, and they had better efficiency, they had more or better morale, they had less conflicts across the organization. And what this data showed was that these were actually over a sample of 100 companies showed a trend in the data that the BPR gurus did not show through various case studies. So this was important because it actually allowed executives to see what companies that were successful were specifically doing, as opposed to just pointing out a couple of companies that had success and wondering if that was the exception or the rule. The second concept is that new IT systems started emerging that allowed BPM to become successful. So we talked about support immaturity a couple minutes ago. Well, now we had enterprise resource planning systems and workflow management systems that allowed business process management to become successful. So enterprise resource planning basically takes the functional flow and the functional logic and the flow logic, which is to say functional logic is logic for an individual task, and then flow logic is basically a series of tasks that flow together to show how a process works, and integrates them and allows executives across the company, or I should say any stakeholders across the company, to see one homogeneous view, integrated view of functions and flows. Workflow management systems, by contrast, actually break up explicitly the functional logic and the flow logic, and this allows them to be more customizable. So it's a bit more technology and process driven as opposed to the data driven ERPs, but they both work in hand pretty well to allow the BPMs to work. So that brings me to my discussion question of which of the two key factors of BPM do you feel was more important and why? So was it the fact that data trends started emerging that showed the success of BPM, or was it that technology finally caught up and allowed BPM to be successful? So anyhow, thank you very much for listening. I appreciate it, and I look forward to your responses. Oh, and there's my works cited page.